Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for our very last episode of Our World of Stories this summer. My name is Miss Afton, and I'm the Children's Librarian at the Alexander Hamilton Library. This summer, for this series, we've been talking all about fairy tales and folk tales as we tell them in the United States, and looking at how those same stories are told in different cultures and countries around the world. Now, if you've watched our other videos, you know that our inspiration is taken from the Arne Thompson-Uther Index, an index that was started over 100 years ago and is still being updated with thousands of stories around the world being grouped into different topics. And if you've seen some of our old stories or our old episodes, you know that one of the biggest classifications in the index is, of course, the story of Cinderella. So way back in the beginning of June, our very first story was about Cinderella, and we talked about the story in the United States, and we also looked at how Cinderella is told in China with the story of Ye Shen. We also talked about how there are arguably over 3,000 different versions of Cinderella around the world. And today, I am very excited to finish off this series by reading a story that is inspired by what is thought to be the original Cinderella story. So we'll get to our book today in just a second. First though, let's recap how Cinderella is typically told in the United States, courtesy of the 1950s Cinderella movie from Disney. We start with a girl whose mother has died. Her father remarries and marries a woman who's not very kind. But then her father ultimately dies, leaving her in the care of her mean stepmother and stepsisters. So Cinderella, the girl, becomes a servant in her own home until one day the king decides that the prince will marry, and so he's going to throw a ball. So Cinderella is so excited to go, but her stepsisters ruin her chances of going, and she's left at home to cry by herself as her stepmother and stepsisters go to the ball to try to snag a prince. Thankfully, Cinderella is saved when her fairy godmother shows up. Because Cinderella has such a kind heart and a gentle spirit, her fairy godmother helps Cinderella by giving her a beautiful dress and carriage, and of course, some very fancy glass slippers to wear to the ball. But all of the magic will disappear at the stroke of 12 at midnight that night. So Cinderella goes to the ball. She looks so beautiful that the prince dances with her all night and they fall in love. At the stroke of 12, at the 12th stroke at midnight though, Cinderella runs away, leaving a single glass slipper behind. The prince promises that he will only marry the girl whose foot fits the glass slippers. And so he searches all over the kingdom until finally he is reunited with Cinderella, who also has the second slipper, or the original pair. So that's, in a nutshell, how we usually think of Cinderella in the United States. But today, we are going to travel to Egypt. So the original story of Cinderella is actually thought to be about a slave girl from Greece who is taken to Egypt called Rhodophis. So the story of Rhodophis takes place in Egypt and has to do with the Pharaoh, who is the king of Egypt. Before we start our book though, let's get ready to travel. So will you count down with me? 3, 2, 1. All right, now let's read. So our story is The Egyptian Cinderella by Shirley Climo, illustrated by Ruth Heller. And like I said, this is a story that is inspired by the original tale. After we read the book, there's some information from the author about the original story that we'll also go over, which is pretty cool. It's exciting stuff. So we have The Egyptian Cinderella. So long ago, in the land of Egypt, where the green Nile River widens to meet the blue sea, there lived a maiden called Rhodophis. When she was still a small child, Rhodophis had been stolen by pirates. She was snatched from her home in Greece, taken across the sea to Egypt, and there sold as a slave. Like the Egyptian servant girls, Rhodophis went to the water's edge each day to wash clothes or to gather the reeds that grew along the riverbank. But Rhodophis looked different from the Egyptian girls. Their eyes were brown and hers were green. Their hair hung straight to their shoulders, while the breeze blew hers into tangles. Their skin glowed like copper, but her pale skin burned red beneath the sun. That was how she got her name, for Rhodophis meant rosy-cheeked in Greek. "Rosy Rhodophis!" scoffed the servant girls, hissing her name between their teeth. Rhodophis pretended not to hear, but she blushed rosier than ever. Although her master was kind, he was old and liked to doze beneath a fig tree. He seldom heard the servant girls tease Rhodophis. He never saw them ordering her about. "Hurry, Rhodophis!" they would shout at her. "The geese are in the garden eating up the onions!" "Mend my robe!" "I'm hungry, Rhodophis! Bake the bread!" Rhodophis always hurried to do their bidding, for the Egyptian girls were household servants, and she was only a slave. Rhodophis found friends among the animals instead. Birds ate crumbs from her hands. She coaxed a monkey to sit upon her shoulder and charmed a hippopotamus with her songs. It would raise its head from the muddy waters and prick its small ears to listen. Sometimes, when her chores were done and the day had cooled, Rhodophis would dance for her animal companions. She twirled so lightly that her tiny bare feet scarcely touched the ground. One evening, her master awakened to see her dance. "No goddess is more nimble," he called out. "Such a gift deserves reward." He tugged his chin whiskers, thinking, and then declared, "You shall go barefoot no longer." Her master ordered a pair of dainty slippers made especially for Rhodophis. The soles were of real leather, and the toes were gilded with rose-red gold. Now, when Rhodophis danced, her feet sparkled like fireflies. The rosy red slippers set Rhodophis more apart than ever. The Egyptian servant girls were jealous, for they wore clumsy sandals woven from papyrus. Out of spite, they found new tasks for her to do, keeping Rhodophis so busy that she was too tired to dance at night. One evening, Kipa, who was chief among the servant girls, announced, "Tomorrow we sail to Memphis to see the Pharaoh. His Majesty is going to hold court for all of his subjects." "There will be musicians and dancing," said another servant girl, eyeing the rose-red slippers. "There will be feasting," added a third. "Poor Rhodophis, you must stay behind," Kipa jeered. "You have linen to wash and grain to grind and the garden to weed." The next morning, just as Ra the sun was climbing into the sky, Rhodophis followed the servant girls to the riverbank. Kipa wore a necklace of blue beads. Bracelets jingled on the wrists of the second. The third had tied a many-colored sash about her waist. Although Rhodophis wore a plain tunic, on her feet were the rose-red slippers. "Perhaps they will let me come along to see the Pharaoh after all," she thought. But the three servant girls pulled their raft around the bend in the river without giving Rhodophis a backward glance. Rhodophis sighed and turned to the basket piled high with dirty clothes. "Wash the linen, weed the garden, grind the grain." She slapped the wooden paddle against the cloth in time to her song. The hippopotamus, tired of so dull a tune, pushed out of the reeds and splashed into the river. "Shame!" cried Rhodophis, shaking her paddle. "You splattered mud on my beautiful slippers." She polished the shoes on the hem of her tunic until the rosy gold glittered in the sun. Then she carefully put them on the bank behind her. "Wash the linen, weed the garden," Rhodophis began again, when suddenly a shadow fell on the water. Rhodophis jumped up. A great falcon, the symbol of the god Horus, circled in the sky with wings spread so wide that they blotted out the sun. "Greetings to you, proud Horus," Rhodophis murmured. She bowed her head and felt a rush of air on the back of her neck. So what does the hawk take? When Rhodophis dared to lift her eyes, she saw the falcon soar away. Dangling from his talons was one of her beautiful slippers. "Stop!" she pleaded. "Come back!" But the bird did not heed her. He flew toward the sun until he was no more than a dark speck against the gold. Rhodophis bit her tongue. One shoe was worse than none at all. Now she'd have to dance like a stork, hopping about on one foot, and even the monkey would laugh. Rhodophis tucked the slipper into her tunic and returned to her laundry, salting the river with her tears. So where do you think the shoe has gone? After Rhodophis had lost sight of the falcon, the mighty bird followed the course of the Nile to the city of Memphis, to the square where the Pharaoh was holding court. There the falcon watched and waited. And you can see in his talons is Rhodophis's shoe. The Pharaoh's name was Amasis. On his head he wore the red and white crown of the two Egypts. The double crown was heavy and pinched his ears. He preferred driving his chariot fast as the wind to sitting on the throne. Amasis yawned. At that very moment, the falcon dropped the red rose slipper into his lap. The slipper was so bright that Amasis thought it was a scrap of the sun. Then he saw the falcon wheeling overhead. "The god Horus sends me a sign," exclaimed the Pharaoh. He picked up the rose-red slipper. "Every maiden in Egypt must try this shoe. She whose foot it fits shall be my queen. That is the will of the gods." Amasis dismissed the court, called for his chariot, and began his search at once. When the Egyptian servant girls arrived in Memphis, they found the throne empty and the streets deserted. They were so angry on their return that even seeing Rhodophis without her rose-red slipper did not please them. "Slaves are better off barefoot," snapped Kipa. The Pharaoh journeyed to distant cities. He tracked the desert where pyramids tower over the sand, and he climbed the steep cliffs where falcons nest. The rose-red slipper was always in his hand. Wherever he went, women and girls, rich or poor, flocked to try on the slipper. But none could fit into so small a shoe. The longer Amasis searched, the more determined he became to marry the maiden who had lost the tiny slipper. He summoned his royal barge and vowed to visit every land along the Nile. The barge was hung with sails of silk, trumpets blared, and oarsmen rode to the beat of gongs. The din was so dreadful. When the barge rounded the bend in the river, Rhodophis fled in alarm. But the servant girls ran to the water's edge. "Now we will see the Pharaoh," cried Kipa. Amasis held up the rose-red slipper. "Whoever can wear this shoe shall be my queen." The servant girls knew that shoe, and knew its owner, too. Yet they clapped their hands over their mouths and said nothing. If one of them could wear it. First Kipa, then the others tried to put on the slipper. Each cramped her foot and curled her toes and squeezed until tears ran down her cheeks. Still, her heel hung over. "Enough," said Amasis wearily. He would have set sail again had he not chanced to see Rhodophis peering through the rushes. "Come," he commanded. "You must try this rose-red slipper." The servant girls gawked open-mouthed as the Pharaoh kneeled before Rhodophis. He slipped the tiny shoe on her foot with ease. Then Rhodophis pulled its mate from the folds of her tunic. "Behold," cried Amasis, "in all this land there is none so fit to be queen." Interesting criteria. "But Rhodophis is a slave," protested one of the servant girls. Kipa sniffed. she's not even Egyptian. She is the most Egyptian of us all, the Pharaoh declared, for her eyes are as green as the Nile, her hair as feathery as papyrus, and her skin the pink of a lotus flower. The Pharaoh led Rhodophis to the royal barge, and with every step, her rose-red slippers winked and sparkled in the sun. So that is the story of Rhodophis, the story that's thought to be the original Cinderella story. And like I said, the author actually provides some background information on the story, which we don't normally read this because I like to let the story stand on its own. But I thought this was so interesting to see where this story originated and the fact versus fiction that I want to read it to you today too. We have the author's note. The tale of Rhodophis and the red rose slippers is one of the world's oldest Cinderella stories. It was first recorded by the Roman historian Strabo in the 1st century BC. So that's before the year 0, over 2,000 years ago. That's a pretty old story. The story is both fact and fable. Rhodophis is believed to have been born in northern Greece, kidnapped by pirates as a child, and sold to a rich man on the island of Samos. One of her fellow slaves was a homely little man named Aesop, who told her wonderful fables about animals. When Rhodophis was almost grown, she was taken to Egypt and bought by a man named Charaxus. His new master was also Greek, and he gave many gifts and favors to Rhodophis. In those days, a fortunate slave might live far better than a hired servant. The servants, although they were free, were poor and lived in mud huts, while a chosen slave enjoyed the comforts of a master's villa. The existence of the rose-red slippers is possible. Ancient Egyptian gold was sometimes mixed with iron, which gave it a reddish hue. And in retelling this story, the author preferred to have the gilded slippers stolen by a falcon, although some stories reference the name of the bird as an eagle. So Horus, the Egyptian sky god and deity of the living pharaohs, was believed to appear on Earth as a falcon. So that's why the author probably did that. Then, what is fact is that a Greek slave girl named Rhodophis married the pharaoh Amasis, who is pharaoh from 570 to 526 BC, and became his queen. So we don't know if all of the details of the story of Rhodophis are true, but we do know that there was a Greek slave who married the pharaoh in 570, or during his reign from 570 to 526. So even if this story might not be totally true, we do know that it is based in real people, which is pretty exciting considering there are so many different versions of this story around the world. So, we hope that you enjoyed our Cinderella story today with the original Cinderella, Rhodophis, out of Egypt and Greece. And we also hope that you enjoyed our other stories throughout the summer. We read some really great stories this summer, and we hope that you enjoyed them all. I know that I had some personal favorites myself. And today, to get your secret code for our summer reading program, since it's the last week and prizes are coming up, we just want to hear what your favorite story was from over the summer so far. So if you liked one of the original US tellings of the fairy tales that we told, it could be The Tortoise and the Hare, it could be Cinderella, it could be Beauty and the Beast. We told lots of different ones. So you can pick one from the US or share one that you really liked from a different country. I know that my favorite was probably Mufaro's Beautiful Daughters, as told from Zimbabwe. So share yours in the comments with us, or you can share it with me at afrancis@ahmfl.org to get a code worth 30 bonus points as we finish up our summer reading program this Friday. So thanks for joining us for our World of Stories. We'll see you next time.